50 years of marriage. Half a century of shared life, built on trust, love, and partnership, or so I thought. Sitting in my home office that evening, surrounded by memories of a life I believed was solid, I received the first crack in the foundation. The email came as a surprise. It wasn't from a friend or business associate but from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "A check on your wife." My first reaction wasn't suspicion but irritation. I assumed it was some scam or a bad joke. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were photos, slyly taken pictures of my wife, Susan, sitting too close to a man at a restaurant. Her hand lightly rested on his arm, her smile reserved only for him. I leaned back in my chair, scanning the pictures. They weren't blurry or misleading. The lighting was dim, but her body language was loud and clear. The man was younger, fit, and dressed in casual attire. A trainer, maybe? Her new obsession with fitness suddenly made more sense. I didn't rage. I didn't panic. I didn't feel hurt. What I felt was sharp, cold clarity. 50 years of marriage didn't make me blind, and I wasn't about to play the fool. I closed my laptop and walked into the kitchen where Susan was humming to herself, preparing tea. She smiled at me like she always did, and for a second, I almost admired her audacity. "Busy day?" she asked, placing a cup on the counter. "Very," I replied evenly, my eyes steady on her. She didn't waver under my gaze, but she didn't know what I knew. Not yet. I'd never been the type to lash out in anger or act on impulse. That's the difference between a strong man and a weak one, a control. Weak men scream, break things, or beg. Strong men plan. As she turned to wash the dishes, I spoke calmly. "Who's the guy you've been spending your afternoons with, Susan?" She froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to notice. Turning slowly, she laughed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't reply immediately. Silence can be more intimidating than words. Finally, I said, "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You'd be wise not to insult me by pretending otherwise." Her expression shifted. The smile faded, replaced by something harder, colder. "You being ridiculous," she said. But there was no conviction in her voice. "I've seen the photos," I continued, my tone steady, my posture unwavering. "And I know there's more to it than some innocent meetings. So don't waste my time, Susan." There was no shouting, no threats, just the weight of undeniable truth. She opened her mouth, likely to spin some half-baked excuse, but I raised my hand. "Save it. Whatever lie you're about to tell me, I'm not interested. What you need to focus on now is packing your things, because you won't be living here much longer." Susan's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious." The rest of the evening was spent in cold, deliberate action. While she sputtered about how I was overreacting, I was already changing the passwords on our accounts, freezing joint credit cards, and drafting a message to our children. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the beginning of a clean break, one she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. I recorded everything. Every conversation. Every interaction. Not because I needed proof, I had more than enough, but because a smart man never gives his opponent room to recover. She thought I'd forgive her. She thought I'd be like other men she'd heard about, at begging for explanations, offering second chances, or drowning in my own misery. But she forgot who she married. I'm not a man who tolerates betrayal. The kitchen felt colder after that conversation. Not because of the temperature, but because of the silence that had fallen between us. Susan didn't follow me as I walked out of the room. She stayed rooted in place, clutching the edge of the counter as if it could somehow stabilize the world she thought she controlled. I didn't need to hear more excuses. I'd heard them all before, from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances who'd faced similar betrayals. It didn't mean anything, It was a mistake, you've been distant. They all sang the same tired tune, and I wasn't interested in listening to Susan's version. In my office, I began executing the next steps of my plan. When you're with someone for 50 years, you don't just share a life, you share accounts, property, and connections. A weak man would let his emotions drive him, but I'd learned long ago that the key to winning any battle is preparation. I pulled out a list I'd started making weeks ago when I first suspected something was off. It wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. A shift in her demeanor, a change in her routines, and the unmissable presence of guilt in her voice when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The first item on my list, control the assets. I logged into our shared bank accounts and began transferring funds into a separate account under my name. The house was mine, bought long before we got married, so I didn't need to worry about that. But I froze her credit cards and cancelled any joint ones. She wouldn't be using my money to fund her little adventures anymore. Next, I accessed our home surveillance system. A smart investment I'd made years ago, not for this purpose, but it turned out to be invaluable. I downloaded clips from the days and times I knew she'd been meeting her so-called trainer. The footage showed her leaving the house dressed to impress, a look of excitement on her face that I hadn't seen in years. It didn't hurt me, it fueled me. Seeing her act like a lovesick teenager while I worked to provide her with the life she had didn't stir sadness. It stirred a cold, calculating anger. The second item, inform the necessary people. I called my lawyer. He was an old friend and had been handling my affairs for decades. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't sound surprised. "I've seen this too many times, Chris," he said. "What's your goal?" "My goal," I replied without hesitation, "is to ensure she has nothing to come back to. I want the divorce filed immediately, and I want her out of the house before the end of the week. You've got a solid case, especially with the evidence you've gathered. I'll draft the paperwork tonight. As for the house, you're well within your rights to have her removed." The third item, leverage her lover's weaknesses. Through the same network of contacts that helped me succeed in business, I started digging into her trainer. It didn't take long to find his name, Michael, and the gym where he worked. A few phone calls later, I had his full name, address, and a few juicy tidbits about his reputation. Turns out, Michael had a habit of getting too close to married women. His gym wasn't just a place for fitness, it was his personal playground. And that wasn't the worst of it. He had a history of financial troubles and a suspended license for drunk driving. A man like that doesn't deserve respect, he deserves consequences. I contacted the gym's management anonymously, providing them with evidence of Michael's inappropriate relationships with clients. The owner didn't sound surprised either. "This isn't the first complaint we've had about him," they said. "We'll handle it internally." Internally or not, I knew his days there were numbered. By the time I returned to the living room, Susan had retreated upstairs. I heard the faint sound of drawers opening and closing. Maybe she was packing. Or maybe she was trying to figure out her next move. I sat down on the couch, the weight of the day settling over me. It wasn't sadness or regret, it was clarity. Clarity that the woman I'd built my life with had been eroding the foundation of our marriage for who knows how long. When you've been betrayed, it's easy to let anger cloud your judgment. But anger without direction is a weapon turned against yourself. I wouldn't allow that. Every move I made was calculated, every decision a step toward reclaiming control. Susan came downstairs an hour later, her face pale but defiant. "We need to talk," she said. "We've already talked," I replied, my tone as cold as the air between us. She hesitated, clutching the banister as if it would give her strength. It's not what you think. Michael is just a friend." I laughed, not a warm laugh, but a short, sharp one. "A friend you sneak around with? A friend you lie to me about? Don't insult my intelligence, Susan. I've already seen the pictures." Her expression faltered, but she recovered quickly. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lonely, Chris. You always so busy. Stop, I interrupted, standing. Don't you dare try to blame this on me. 50 years, Susan. I gave you 50 years, and this is how you repay me? With excuses? Her defiance crumbled, replaced by tears. But tears wouldn't save her. Not this time. I've always believed that true power lies in preparation. A man who acts without thinking is just another fool, rushing toward his own defeat. That night, while Susan retreated to the guest bedroom upstairs, likely trying to conjure up her next excuse, I stayed in the living room, phone in hand, refining my plan. She thought she knew me. 50 years of marriage must have given her a sense of security. She likely believed I was predictable, the kind of man who'd confront her with tears or anger. What she didn't realize was that I had been watching her for weeks, collecting the threads of her betrayal and weaving them into a noose. The next morning, before Susan even woke up, I contacted a locksmith. By 8 a.m., every lock in the house had been replaced. Susan could enjoy her morning coffee knowing she was living on borrowed time. When she eventually came downstairs, I was sitting at the kitchen table, calmly reading the morning paper. The hum of the coffee machine was the only sound in the room. She stopped in the doorway, hesitating, as if she sensed the shift in power. "What's going on, Chris?" she asked cautiously. I didn't even look up. "Just securing my home." Her brow furrowed. "Your home?" "Yes," I replied, folding the paper and setting it down. "I had the locks changed this morning. You'll have a key, for now, but don't think for a second that you'll keep it if you try to push me." Her face paled, but she stayed silent. Smart move. That same afternoon, I called our 2 adult children, John and Megan. They're grown, with families of their own, but this wasn't a conversation I could delay. I didn't sugarcoat anything. "Your mother has been unfaithful," I said plainly. There was silence on the other end of the line before John spoke. "Dad, are you sure?" "I mean, it's Mom." "Would I have called you if I wasn't sure?" I snapped. "I have the proof, and I've already started taking action. I just thought you both should know." Megan, usually the more empathetic of the two, was uncharacteristically cold. "I don't know what to say. This doesn't sound like her." "People change," I said flatly. "I need you both to understand that I'm not interested in hearing excuses for her. She betrayed me, betrayed our family, and now she'll face the consequences." John sighed. "What do you want us to do?" "Nothing," I replied. "Just be prepared. Things will escalate quickly, and I don't want you blindsided." The conversation ended without much resolution, but I knew they'd process the information in their own time. I wasn't looking for validation. I simply wanted the truth to be out in the open. By evening, I had compiled every piece of dirt I could find on Susan's lover. Michael wasn't just a trainer, he was a parasite. He targeted older, wealthier women, charming his way into their lives and wallets. It disgusted me to think Susan had been gullible enough to fall for it, but I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. Through a private investigator, I obtained detailed information about Michael's finances, his questionable business practices, and even his dating history. The man was reckless, leaving a trail of debts and burned bridges wherever he went. I contacted a few of his former clients, women who had likely been through the same manipulation Susan was experiencing. Their anger was palpable, and they didn't hesitate to share their stories with me. Armed with this information, I drafted an anonymous letter to Michael's gym management, attaching evidence of his predatory behavior. By the time I was done, his career was as good as over. My lawyer had been working diligently since the previous night, and by noon the next day, I had signed the initial divorce papers. Susan would be served within 24 hours. Every asset was accounted for, every legal loophole closed. I even included a clause that would prevent her from re-entering the house once the divorce was finalized. She'd have no claim to the property, no access to my accounts, and no foothold to claw her way back into my life. That night, I confronted her again. Not in anger, but with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon making the first cut. "Susan," I said, standing in the doorway of the guest bedroom where she'd been hiding all day. "You've been served." She looked up from her phone, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" I tossed the papers onto the bed. "Divorce. Effective immediately." Her hands trembled as she picked up the documents, scanning them with wide eyes. "Chris, I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "There it is," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. The classic cheater's refrain, "It was a mistake." Save your breath, Susan. I don't care about your excuses. This isn't a discussion. It's a decision. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "You can stay here for now," I continued. "But you'll be gone by the end of the week." "And Michael? His days as a trainer are over. You might want to check on him before his life falls apart completely." Her face crumbled as reality set in. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't in control. I was. The morning after handing Susan the divorce papers, the house felt like enemy territory. She moved quietly, avoiding me, her footsteps softer than usual on the hardwood floors. She didn't speak, but I could feel her desperation growing. She spent the night messaging someone, Michael, most likely, trying to find a lifeline. While she sulked upstairs, I stayed in the living room, phone in hand, setting the next steps into motion. I knew Susan wouldn't go down without a fight. Betrayal always comes with excuses, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate her way out of this. First, I updated our lawyer. "Make sure everything is airtight," I told him. "I want this over as soon as possible. No delays, no loopholes." "You handling this the right way," he replied. "Keep calm, stick to the facts, and don't let emotions cloud your decisions." Calm? That wasn't a problem. Every move I made was calculated. I wasn't a man swayed by feelings, I was a man determined to take back what was mine. By mid-morning, I made another critical call. This one to a close business partner, Robert, who also happened to be a member of our social circle. I didn't sugarcoat anything. "I need you to know what's been happening," I began. "Susan's been unfaithful. I've already started the divorce process, and I'm taking steps to ensure this doesn't spiral out of control." Robert, a no-nonsense type of man, didn't mince words. "Chris, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you need anything from me?" "I just need the truth out there," I said firmly. "People are going to talk, and I don't want her spinning some sob story to gain sympathy. I want the facts clear, as she chose this. Not me." We agreed to meet for lunch the next day. It wasn't about gossip, it was about control. By addressing the situation directly, I could stay ahead of the narrative. Around noon, I received a call from the gym where Michael worked. "We've reviewed the complaints you submitted," the manager said, his tone serious. "Michael is no longer employed here." It was a small victory, but it was only the beginning. I could almost picture Michael's smug confidence crumbling as he realized his charm wouldn't save him this time. Susan must have sensed something was happening because she came downstairs while I was on the call. She hovered near the kitchen doorway, pretending to be busy with a cup of tea. "What are you planning, Chris?" she finally asked, her voice strained. I ended the call and looked at her with the kind of cold detachment she wasn't used to. "You lost the right to ask me that the moment you chose someone else." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might fight back. But instead, she turned and walked away. That evening, I made another call, this one to Megan, a daughter. "Megan, I need you to come over tomorrow," I said. Why? What's going on? She asked, her tone cautious. There's something you and John need to see. It's about your mother. I could feel the hesitation on the other end of the line, but she agreed. The next day, both Megan and John arrived at the house, their expressions tense. Susan tried to avoid them at first, staying upstairs, but I wasn't going to let her hide. I called her down, and when she appeared, her face was pale. This is ridiculous, Chris, she said, her voice trembling. Why are you dragging them into this? They deserve the truth, I replied. Turning to our children, I said, I'm sorry to put you in this position, but you need to know what's been going on. Your mother has been unfaithful. Megan's hand flew to her mouth, and John looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I didn't want it to come to this, I continued, but I've gathered the evidence. She betrayed me, and she betrayed our family. Susan started to speak, but I held up a hand. Don't. You've said enough. I handed Megan and John a folder containing the photos and messages I'd collected. They didn't say much as they looked through it, but the disappointment in their eyes was unmistakable. How could you do this, Mom? Megan finally whispered. Susan tried to defend herself, talking about loneliness and feeling neglected. But the words rang hollow. John shook his head and stood. I need some air, he muttered, walking out the door. Megan stayed behind, staring at Susan like she didn't recognize her anymore. You broke this family, she said quietly before following her brother. Susan sank into a chair, her face in her hands. For the first time, she looked defeated. After they left, I returned to my office to finalize the last steps. I'd arranged for movers to come the next morning to pack Susan's belongings. A separate account had been set up to handle any remaining financial obligations, and the divorce hearing was scheduled for later that month. As I sat there, I felt no satisfaction, only resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming the respect I'd worked a lifetime to build. Susan thought she could undermine that with her selfish choices, but she underestimated me. By the end of the week, she would be gone, and I would begin rebuilding my life without the weight of her betrayal. By the end of the week, the house felt like enemy territory, but only for Susan. For me, it was mine again, a place I had reclaimed from her betrayal. She moved through it like a stranger, careful and quiet, knowing every step brought her closer to the door. I had arranged for the movers to come that Friday morning. They worked efficiently, boxing up her belongings without unnecessary chatter. I supervised from a distance, ensuring nothing important to me was packed by mistake. Every item they took was a reminder of a life that no longer existed. Susan tried to engage with me several times during the week, but her words bounced off the cold wall I'd built. I wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. The time for that had passed. This isn't fair, Chris, she finally said on the morning the movers arrived, her voice strained but lacking the confidence it once carried. I looked at her, my expression unchanging. You're right. It's not. But fairness died the moment you invited another man into our life. She opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. I turned back to the movers, giving them instructions for the final items. That afternoon, I had one last piece of business to address, Michael. I knew where he lived, and the private investigator had been thorough. His gym career was over, his reputation irreparably damaged by the complaints I had submitted. But that wasn't enough. A man like him, who preyed on married women for his own gain, needed to understand the consequences of his actions. I waited for him outside his apartment complex. It wasn't hard to spot him when he arrived. He looked exactly like the kind of man who thought his charm was his greatest asset. His confidence, however, had clearly taken a hit. His shoulders slumped as he stepped out of his car, his movements slow and heavy. Michael, I called, my voice calm but commanding. He froze, his head snapping toward me. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a thin veneer of composure. Mr. Harrington, he said, his tone cautious. I walked toward him, my stride measured. We need to talk. Michael's eyes darted around, as though searching for an escape, but he stood his ground. Look, I don't know what Susan told you, but... I cut him off, my voice sharp. Susan's not the one talking right now. I am. And I know exactly who you are and what you've been doing. His composure faltered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he said weakly. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Didn't mean for it to happen? You've made a career out of targeting women like Susan. You knew exactly what you were doing. Michael shifted his weight nervously, his hands fidgeting at his sides. What do you want from me? Simple, I replied. I want you gone. You've lost your job, and soon you'll lose whatever else you're clinging to in this town. If you're smart, you'll pack your things and disappear before it gets worse. He hesitated, as though considering his options, but he must have realized there weren't any. You've already ruined me, he muttered. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. Not yet. But I will if you don't listen. Leave. Now. Michael nodded reluctantly, the fight leaving his posture. He turned and walked toward his apartment without another word. I didn't bother watching him go. He was already irrelevant. That evening, Susan sat in the living room for what I knew would be the last time. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine. I stood across from her, arms crossed. The movers will finish tomorrow. The storage unit is paid for 6 months. After that, it's your problem. She looked up at me, her face pale and tired. Chris, please. Can we at least talk about this? After everything we've been through? We're past talking, I said firmly. You made your choice when you lied to me. When you betrayed me. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. You didn't just betray me, I continued. You betrayed our marriage. You disrespected the life we built together. And without respect, there's nothing left. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. Don't. Just leave. The papers are signed, the arrangements are made, and by this time tomorrow, you'll be gone. She looked down, defeated. For the first time, she didn't argue. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the weight of the week lift slightly. It wasn't over yet, but the end was in sight. I hadn't just regained control, I had reclaimed my dignity, my home, and my future. Susan underestimated me. She thought I would falter, beg, or forgive. But a man who knows his worth doesn't need forgiveness. He demands respect, and takes it back when it's denied. Tomorrow, she'd leave for good. And I would finally be free. The morning Susan was set to leave felt like the end of a long and exhausting chapter. The movers showed up early, their truck rumbling softly in the driveway as they began loading her belongings. It was a methodical process, box after box, bag after bag, until the house felt emptier with every passing minute. Susan lingered near the front door, her arms crossed, not speaking but occasionally glancing in my direction. She had stopped trying to argue a few days ago when it became clear there was no room for negotiation. Every word she said had been met with the same cold finality, "This is what you chose." I stood near the entryway, watching as the last of her life was packed up and carried out. The storage unit is already set up, I told her, holding out the paperwork. You'll need to sign here before they take everything. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with shaky hands, she took the pen and signed. Chris, she started, her voice thin and barely audible, I didn't mean for it to end like this. I met her gaze with steady eyes. But it did, didn't it? And that's on you. Her lips quivered like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. I nodded toward the driveway. It's time to go. The movers closed the truck's doors with a heavy metallic clang, and Susan hesitated as if she had something else to add. But in the end, she just walked to her car, started the engine, and followed the moving truck down the driveway. I watched until her car turned the corner and disappeared from view. Only then did I close the front door. That day, I didn't waste time wallowing in memories or second-guessing my decisions. Instead, I set to work reclaiming the house. It had been ours for 50 years, but after what she did, it no longer felt like a shared space. It needed to reflect my life now, without her. I started in the master bedroom. The bed, once neatly made with the linens she had picked out, now felt like a relic of the past. I stripped it bare and replaced the sheets and comforter with a new set I'd purchased earlier that week. The vanity table was next. Her perfumes, jewelry, and cosmetics had been cleared out by the movers, but the faint scent of her still lingered. I wiped everything down until the surface gleamed, then moved my things into the empty drawers. In the closet, I found a few stray items, a scarf, an old pair of shoes, a jacket she'd forgotten to pack. I tossed them into a box and added it to the pile I planned to donate. The living room was another project altogether. Susan had always insisted on filling the shelves with decorative items, figurines, photo frames, little trinkets she'd picked up over the years. One by one, I packed them away, leaving the shelves clean and bare. It wasn't just about removing her influence. It was about taking back control, one small act at a time. By the time I was done, the house felt lighter. Not empty, just free. Later that evening, as I sat in the living room, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the last few weeks. This was different. Peaceful. Susan's betrayal had changed everything, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had reminded me of my strength. Some men would have begged for forgiveness or clung to the scraps of what was left. Not me. I knew better. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And once it's lost, there's no getting it back. As I looked around the room, I felt a strange sense of relief. Susan was gone, and so was the weight of her lies. The life we had built together was over, but a new chapter was beginning. One where I called the shots. The morning after Susan left, the house felt completely different. The kind of different you can't quite put into words, but it settles in your chest and tells you something has shifted for good. It wasn't just quiet, there had always been silence between us in the last few weeks, but this was a peaceful quiet. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I stayed in bed a little longer than usual, letting the stillness of the house settle over me. No hurried footsteps down the hall. No clinking of cups in the kitchen. It felt strange but not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt overdue. I knew the work ahead of me wasn't over. Divorce wasn't just a break in a relationship, it was a dissection of a life shared. Every piece had to be separated, every detail accounted for. I wasn't going to let anything slip. After making myself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, I sat at the dining table and made a list. Not because I needed to, but because it helped me organize my thoughts. The first item on the list was clearing out the garage. The garage had always been Susan's in-between space, a place where things went when she didn't know what to do with them. Old holiday decorations, knickknacks she swore she'd find a use for, and even some of her forgotten personal items were all crammed into the shelves and corners. Among them were a few boxes of things the movers had left behind. She probably thought I'd hold onto them, or maybe she just forgot. Either way, I wasn't keeping them. I opened the first box. Inside were photo albums, birthday cards, and a handful of souvenirs from trips we'd taken over the years. Once, those things might have brought back fond memories. Now, they felt hollow, like the props of a play I'd walked offstage from. I didn't feel anger as I went through the box. Just a sense of finality. Each item was a piece of a life that no longer existed. It didn't take long to pack everything into my car. I drove to the local donation center and dropped the boxes off without a second thought. Susan could track them down if she wanted, but they weren't my responsibility anymore. With each trip to the car, it felt like I was shedding another layer of the life we had shared. By the time I closed the trunk for the last time, I felt lighter. When I got home, I decided it was time to take care of something else that had been nagging at me, cutting ties with people who didn't deserve a place in my life anymore. Divorce has a way of showing you who your real friends are. Some of the people in our social circle had already made their allegiances clear, whether through silence or by defending Susan when the truth came out. I didn't have room for those kinds of people in my life. I went through my phone, deleting names I knew I'd never call again. The ones who didn't reach out after hearing about the divorce. The ones who'd always been more interested in gossip than genuine friendship. With each name I erased, I felt like I was taking another step toward freedom. One name stood out, Robert. He was a former colleague and a mutual friend of ours. When I'd confided in him about my suspicions months ago, he brushed me off, telling me I was overthinking things. That conversation had stuck with me. If he couldn't take my concerns seriously, he didn't deserve a place in my future. I called him, not to argue, but to be direct. "Robert," I said when he answered, "I think it's best if we go our separate ways." There was a pause. "Chris, I don't understand." "You don't need to," I cut in. "When I came to you about Susan, you dismissed me. That was your choice. This is mine." I didn't wait for him to respond. I ended the call, feeling a weight lift as his name disappeared from my contacts. By the afternoon, I was ready for something different. For too long, my life had revolved around managing chaos, Susan's moods, her betrayals, the fallout of it all. I decided to take a walk through the park, a place I hadn't visited in years. The air was crisp, the kind that stings your cheeks but feels refreshing. Families dotted the paths, kids laughing as they ran through the grass. It reminded me of simpler times, before my life became a cycle of compromises and sacrifices. I stopped by a small cafe on the edge of the park, one I used to frequent in my younger days. The owner, Jack, was still there, and he recognized me immediately. "Chris?" "It's been years," he said with a grin. "Life got in the way," I replied, returning the smile. We talked for a while, catching up on the years I'd missed. Jack had always been easy to talk to, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the tension that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. Before I left, Jack handed me a business card. "Come by anytime," he said. "First coffees on the house for old friends." I thanked him and tucked the card into my wallet. It wasn't much, but it felt like the start of something. When I got home, I sat in the living room, going through the stack of paperwork that had been piling up. Bills, legal documents, and financial plans, all things Susan had neglected while chasing her distractions. I didn't resent the responsibility. If anything, it felt empowering. I was taking control, piece by piece, rebuilding a life that was mine and mine alone. As I worked through the stack, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A better one. The day after Susan's departure, the house felt entirely mine for the first time in decades. I didn't wake up to the weight of her presence lingering in the rooms or the stale energy of our broken relationship. Instead, the silence was peaceful, not oppressive. There was no need to rush, no chaos waiting for me as I stepped out of bed. The air felt clean, as if the house itself had finally exhaled. My first act that morning was simple. I made a pot of coffee, strong and black, and stood by the kitchen window as I drank it. The world outside was moving as it always did, and neighbors walking their dogs, cars pulling out of driveways, and the occasional jogger braving the winter chill. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the time to notice it. By the time I finished my coffee, I knew what I needed to do. The divorce might have stripped Susan from my life, but her chaos still lingered in the details, the finances, the clutter, the forgotten obligations she'd left behind for me to deal with. I had no intention of letting any of it slow me down. I started with the accounts. Over the years, I had taken on the role of managing our finances, and now I was grateful for that decision. It meant there was no confusion about where things stood. The shared accounts were already frozen, and the credit cards cancelled, but there were still loose ends that needed tying. The first thing I tackled was the utilities. Susan and I had shared login details for years, but that wasn't going to work anymore. I went through each account, electricity, gas, internet, and changed the passwords, updating everything to reflect the new reality. This house was mine, and I wasn't sharing it with anyone else. Next, I called the bank to finalize the transfer of our investment account into my name. Susan had always treated it like an afterthought, rarely asking questions or showing interest in where the money went. Now, it was hers to deal with whatever scraps were left in her separate accounts. As I worked through these tasks, I couldn't help but reflect on how much of my life had been spent cleaning up after Susan, not just physically, but emotionally and financially. She had always been impulsive, chasing fleeting interests and leaving behind a mess for me to sort out. At first, I had convinced myself it was a quirk of her personality, something that added spontaneity to our relationship. But now, I saw it for what it was: a recklessness. Her betrayal wasn't a single moment of weakness, it was a culmination of years of disregard for the things that mattered most: trust, respect, and loyalty. As I updated the last account, I felt a strange sense of relief. This wasn't just about cutting ties with Susan, it was about reclaiming my own sense of order. After handling the finances, I turned my attention to the house. The garage was already cleared, but there were still traces of Susan scattered throughout the rooms. A scarf she'd left on the back of a chair, a book on the nightstand that wasn't mine, even the lingering scent of her perfume in the master bedroom. I gathered everything that remained, every item she had forgotten or deliberately left behind, and placed it in a box. There wasn't much, but each object felt like a small weight being lifted as I removed it. Once the box was full, I carried it to the car and drove it to the same donation center I had visited the day before. When I returned, the house felt different again. Cleaner. Lighter. As I walked through the rooms, I started making mental notes of the changes I wanted to make. The living room furniture, the paint in the bedroom, even the art on the walls, all of it had been chosen with Susan's input. Now, it was time to make the space reflect me. By the afternoon, I was ready for a break. The walk I'd taken in the park the day before had been a welcome escape, so I decided to go again. This time, I brought a notebook with me. The park was quieter than the previous day, the paths almost empty except for a few dog walkers and an older couple sitting on a bench. I found a spot near the edge of the pond, where the water reflected the grey sky above, and opened the notebook. At first, I wasn't sure what to write. The pages stared back at me, blank and expectant, but after a few minutes, the words started to come. I didn't write about Susan or the divorce, that chapter was already closed. Instead, I focused on the future. I wrote about the kind of life I wanted to build now that I wasn't tied down by her chaos. Hobbies I wanted to try, places I wanted to visit, even simple things like cooking more for myself or taking weekend trips to the mountains. For so long, I had put her needs above mine, and now I was learning to ask myself what I wanted. By the time I left the park, the notebook was filled with ideas. They weren't big or grandiose, but they were mine. Back at home, I spent the evening tackling another task, organizing my office. It had always been a shared space, cluttered with Susan's papers and half-finished projects. I cleared out the drawers, rearranged the shelves, and made it into something that felt like my own. As the night settled in, I sat at my desk, looking over the space I had reclaimed. The house still had a long way to go, but for the first time, it felt like I was truly moving forward. Susan's departure wasn't the end of my life, it was the start of something better. The fourth morning after Susan's departure marked the beginning of a new phase for me. I woke up with the same sense of calm that had been building over the past few days, but this time, there was something more, a quiet determination to move forward. The house, my space, was slowly taking shape. I wasn't just erasing her presence, I was defining what life would look like from here on out. After my morning coffee, I went out to the backyard with the tools I'd bought the day before. The fence was the first project I planned to tackle. It had been neglected for years, weathered by time and covered in peeling paint. Every warped board felt like a reminder of how Susan had ignored the practicalities of life in favor of chasing fleeting distractions. I set up my workbench near the edge of the yard and pulled out the sander. The hum of the machine cut through the still morning air as I started stripping away the old layers of paint. The repetitive motion was therapeutic, and I found myself falling into a rhythm. Sand, smooth, move. With every pass of the sander, the fence began to reveal its original texture. The work gave me time to think, not about Susan, but about myself. It struck me how much of my life had been spent reacting to her choices. Whether it was adjusting plans to suit her latest whim or managing the fallout from her financial irresponsibility, I had always been in a state of reaction. Now, for the first time in decades, I was acting with intention. By late morning, I had sanded down half the fence. My arms ached, and my hands were stiff from gripping the sander, but it was a satisfying kind of fatigue. I took a break, leaning against the freshly smoothed wood and surveying the yard. It still needed a lot of work, but for the first time, I could see its potential. After a quick lunch, I returned to the fence with a brush and a can of wood stain. As I dipped the brush into the dark liquid and began applying it to the wood, I couldn't help but notice how the stain brought out the grain, giving the fence new life. It felt like a metaphor for what I was doing with my own life, stripping away the old, the broken, and the neglected to reveal something stronger and more enduring. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began to pass by, some pausing to say hello. Most of them were familiar faces I'd seen over the years but never really engaged with. Susan had always been the one to handle small talk, leaving me to focus on the practicalities of maintaining our home and finances. But now, with her gone, I realized I had the opportunity to connect in a way I hadn't before. One neighbor, a man named George, stopped by as I worked. He was in his late 60s, a retired carpenter with a knack for offering unsolicited advice. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said, nodding toward the fence. I smiled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Yeah, it's been a while since anyone gave it any attention." George leaned on the fence, inspecting my work. "Not bad," he said after a moment. "You've got a good eye for detail. You ever done this kind of work before?" "Not in years," I admitted. "But I used to enjoy it. Feels good to get back into it." He nodded. "That's the thing about working with your hands, it clears the mind. You keep at it, and this place will be looking brand new in no time." We chatted for a while, mostly about woodworking and home projects. By the time George left, I felt a surprising sense of camaraderie. It was a small interaction, but it reminded me that there was a world outside of Susan and the chaos she had brought into my life. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I finished staining the fence and stood back to admire my work. The rich, dark color transformed the yard, giving it a sense of warmth and care that had been missing for so long. I packed up my tools and headed inside, where I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sank into the couch. My body was sore, but my mind was clear. The day's work wasn't just about fixing a fence, it was about reclaiming a sense of purpose. Sitting there in the quiet, I thought about the man I used to be before Susan and I began drifting apart. He was decisive, confident, and resourceful. Somewhere along the way, that man had been buried under the weight of trying to keep the peace in a relationship that was already crumbling. But now, piece by piece, I was rediscovering him. That night, I revisited the notebook I'd started earlier in the week. Flipping through the pages, I added a new entry, a focus on the details. Build slowly. Make it yours. The words felt simple but powerful. They weren't just about the house or the yard, they were about my life. There was no rush, no deadline. For the first time, I wasn't working toward someone else's expectations. Before going to bed, I stepped outside one last time to look at the fence under the soft glow of the porch light. It wasn't perfect, there were still a few rough spots I needed to smooth out, but it was mine. As I stood there, I realized that the house, the yard, and even my future were all blank canvases now. The years with Susan had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I could build something better, something entirely my own. The last morning of the week had an unexpected calm to it, like waking up after a long, restless storm to find the world somehow still and serene. Nothing grand had changed in the house overnight, and yet everything felt different. The weight I'd carried for so long was gone. I made my usual coffee, letting the aroma fill the kitchen as I stood at the window, observing the world outside. The backyard, now partially transformed by my work earlier in the week, looked better. The freshly stained fence stood strong, a reminder that progress wasn't about speed but persistence. As I took my first sip of coffee, I thought about how far I'd come in such a short time. Just a week ago, this house felt suffocating, a monument to the wreckage of my marriage. Now, it felt like the beginning of something new, something entirely mine. The day ahead was free of chores or tasks I'd been avoiding. The major things had been dealt with, the finances were under control, the lingering traces of Susan were cleared out, and the house was finally reflecting who I was instead of what she had tried to make it. For the first time in years, I had the chance to focus on creating, not fixing. After breakfast, I drove to the nursery again. The plants I'd put in the backyard the day before had sparked an idea. I wanted to turn the space into a haven. Not for anyone else, not for entertaining guests or impressing neighbors, but for me. Walking through the rows of plants, I let myself imagine what the yard could become. I picked out a few more shrubs to line the patio and some herbs I could grow near the kitchen window. Gardening had never been a passion of mine, but now it felt like an opportunity to nurture something, to watch it grow and thrive. Back at home, I spent the next few hours planting the herbs in small terracotta pots and placing them on the windowsill. The smell of fresh basil and rosemary filled the kitchen, replacing the sterile emptiness it had carried for years. Once the plants were settled, I moved to the backyard, adding the new shrubs along the edge of the patio. It was slow, deliberate work, but it felt good to have a tangible result at the end of the day. When I finished, I stepped back and took in the scene. The yard still wasn't perfect, it would take weeks, maybe months, to get it exactly how I wanted, but it no longer felt like a forgotten corner of the house. It felt alive. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I turned my attention to the living room. One project I had put off all week was replacing the oversized mirror Susan had insisted on keeping above the fireplace. It had always felt out of place, too loud, too ornate, a reflection of her need for attention. Taking it down was a relief. The empty wall felt like a blank canvas, waiting for something meaningful. I remembered the ocean painting I'd bought earlier in the week, still sitting in the corner of the room. I carefully hung the painting in the mirror's place, stepping back to see how it transformed the space. The soft blues and grays of the ocean scene brought a sense of calm to the room. It was simple but powerful, and for the first time, the living room felt like it belonged to me. That evening, I cooked myself a proper dinner, a far cry from the rushed meals and takeout that had dominated my life in recent years. I grilled a salmon fillet and roasted some vegetables, enjoying the process as much as the result. Sitting at the dining table, I ate slowly, without distractions. No television, no phone, just the quiet hum of the house around me. It wasn't lonely. If anything, it was peaceful. After dinner, I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, letting the soft glow of the lamp highlight the new painting. The week had been exhausting, but as I reflected on everything I'd accomplished, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This house wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a home. Not because of the things I'd added or the projects I'd finished, but because it was finally mine. Susan's departure had forced me to confront the parts of my life I'd neglected for years. The cluttered rooms, the untended yard, the stagnant routines, they were all symptoms of a marriage that had long since lost its purpose. Now, those things were changing, just as I was. Before heading to bed, I pulled out the notebook I had been writing in all week. Flipping through the pages, I smiled at the plans and ideas I had already started putting into motion. On the last blank page, I wrote a simple note. This is only the beginning. As I closed the notebook and turned off the light, I felt ready for whatever came next.